Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, an episode on Romanian political parties. So today's episode was requested by Victor Bohus on YouTube, and he has helped me a lot with this episode, giving me information on the parties and keeping me up to date with the political happenings in Romania. So a very big thank you to him. If you want me to talk about another country's political parties, please let me know either in the comments, via email, or via the request form in the description. I currently have requests to do Spanish parties, Indian parties, Malaysian parties, Italian parties, the Chinese United Front parties, Danish parties, maybe a South Africa update, Belgian parties, Colombian parties, Chilean parties, and many more. So Romania very recently had a shakeup in its government, and a new government formed just this past Thursday. The last government had itself divided between its two main players, PNL and USR. Corruption within the government and the sacking of several USR government ministers led USR to leave the coalition, forcing the coalition to find new partners. The current government is now made up of PSD, PNL, and UDMR. You probably don't know what these parties represent, but just know that the current ruling government is on paper fairly unstable, since PNL and PSD focus most of their campaign efforts during election time to insult one another. So first, let's look at the Chamber of Deputies, the lower house in Romania's parliament. The Chamber of Deputies has 330 deputies. The majority of these are elected via proportional representation, from voters in 43 multi-member districts found throughout Romania and the diaspora. In order to make it into parliament, a party needs either 5% of the national vote or 20% of the vote in 4 different districts. 18 deputies are reserved for minority groups in Romania, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. The deputies write and vote on rules and regulations for Romania, and will elect the Prime Minister of the country, who operates under a relatively strong president. There also is the Senate, the upper house of Romania's parliament. It has 136 senators who are elected pretty much via the exact same deal the deputies in the Chamber of Deputies are elected, except with no reserved minority seats. The Senate does essentially the same job as the Chamber of Deputies, writing rules and regulations and electing the Prime Minister, with the Chamber of Deputies being only slightly more powerful and being allowed the final say if the two houses disagree on something. But, considering both chambers of parliament are elected at the same time, they tend to have very similar compositions, so disagreements are few and far between. Romania also is a member of the EU, with it sending 33 members to EU Parliament. Also, finally, before I begin, if you are curious about corruption in Romania, which really does plague the country, Victor sent me a really interesting video from the YouTube channel Recorder that talks about corruption and the problems in the medical industry in Romania. I'll link it in the description if that interests you at all. So now let's go to the parties. And first off, we have the Social Democratic Party, or Partidul Social Democrat, or PSD. It is unsurprisingly social democratic, and is the main center-left force, and really left-wing force, in the country. However, PSD isn't your standard European social democratic party, with it holding fairly socially conservative values, something that we'll get back to later. It gets a lot of support from the elderly, those without a university education, those without a large income, and the rural population, particularly those from the Wallachia region of southern Romania. It currently has 110 deputies, 47 senators, or roughly 33% of parliament, and sends 9 members to European Parliament, who sit with the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. The current head of the party is Marcel Ciolocu, a deputy and the former deputy prime minister of the country. PSD, being social democratic, supports social democratic positions on the economy. It backs a strong welfare state, wants to reverse the declining birth rate of the country by raising income, and providing more job opportunities in the country, supports increased digitization, and wants to promote environmentalist ideas. However, as stated earlier, it holds socially conservative values. It is a strong supporter of the Romanian Orthodox Church in the country, generally acts in a fairly authoritarian manner when in power, opposes gay marriage, and while not opposed to globalization, it does call for globalization to benefit Romania first. While on its website it claims to be the most pro-EU party in Parliament, most online seem to categorize the party as fairly cautious towards the Union. Talking about problems the PSD faces is hard simply because there's so much stuff I could talk about. It has played a leading role in developing the nation after the fall of communism, and it has certainly helped corruption develop in the country. Many accuse it and most of its high-ranking party members of massive levels of corruption and of holding no real ideology, and just saying whatever it takes to get them into power so they can embezzle state funds and prevent the judiciary from punishing them. This corruption, and some of its more socially conservative stances, have led to it being treated coldly by its fellow Social Democratic MEPs throughout Europe. Next we go to the National Liberal Party, or Partidul Național Liberal, or PNL. Its name comes from the old Romanian Party, the National Liberal Party, that was a party that combined liberalism and Romanian nationalism, which the current party claims to also follow. It can generally be described as a center-right party, supporting liberal and conservative policies, and should on paper be the main enemy of PSD. Its support base is seemingly in some rural areas in southern Romania and Transylvania, and tends to be more middle class, slightly more educated, and involved in the private sector in some way. It currently has 79 deputies, 38 senators, or roughly 26% of parliament, and sends 10 members to European Parliament, who sit in the European People's Party group. It is currently headed by Florin Citu, a senator and former prime minister of the country. The current prime minister, Nicolae Ciucă, is affiliated with the party, and the current president, Klaus Iohannis, while not a member of the party, was elected with PNL support. PNL wants to improve the economy of Romania by supporting increased digitization, spending more on farmers, wants to fight against inflation, and generally supports limited government involvement in the economy and reduced taxes. It is pro-EU and pro-NATO, wants more MPs from the diaspora, and supports greater decentralization. It wants to fight corruption, with it wanting to reduce bureaucracy and supports a meritocracy. However, PNL, much like PSD, is also considered to be widely corrupt. They often are accused of using and upholding a lot of the same shady practices PSD uses when in power, and of not really being a force for change. Currently, the party is undergoing a lot of infighting, with a bunch of MPs along with former party leader, Ludwig Orban, no relation to Hungarian Viktor Orban, leaving the party, who may or may not form a rival center-right political party, which will likely increase the woes of the PNL. Speaking of center-right parties, we have the Democratic Alliance of Hungarians in Romania, or Uniunea Democratică Maghiară de Romania, or UDMR. It is a part of the current government, and based on the name, you can probably guess what the party is about. It was formed around representing the interests of the sizable Hungarian community present in Romania. They also are generally conservative in their outlook, wanting to conserve traditional Hungarian cultural institutions, while also backing more moderate changes in Romania. Its supporters are largely found in Transylvania, particularly on the border with Hungary, and the region known as the K-Land. It currently has 20 deputies, 9 senators, or roughly 6% of parliament, and sends 2 members to European Parliament, who sit in the European People's Party group. It is currently headed by Hunor Kelman, a deputy and the current deputy prime minister of the country. UDMR is very supportive of Hungarian autonomy. It believes in greater autonomy for areas with a large Hungarian presence, and wants to encourage the use of Hungarian in everyday life and education. It is pro-EU and pro-NATO, wants to create a Minister of Family, and backs friendlier relations with Hungary. It tends to back more socially conservative policies, along with fairly centrist economic policies. UDMR is criticized by some for holding no real political agenda. Yes, it wants autonomy for the Hungarians, but it also does very little when in office. The fact that the Hungarian community percentage-wise in Romania is just slightly above the electoral threshold means that Hungarians who want a more principled party that stands up for them have to be careful not to split the vote too much and therefore result in no Hungarian presence in parliament. It has been criticized by Romanian nationalists for dividing Romania and claims the party seeks to separate the Hungarian community from Romania. Also, it has been criticized for being a coalition partner for hire, opportunistically backing governments simply to give them influence. The first opposition party we will talk about is the Save Romania Union, or Uniune Salvati Romania, or USR+. I've seen the party described several different ways, with it being a progressive center-left party, a liberal center-right party, or a centrist party bridging social liberalism and laissez-faire economics. Importantly, it is a party that stands for transparency, fighting corruption and the current political system, and is pro-EU. Its supporters tend to be young, found in urban areas, are usually university educated, apparently, according to Victor, drive an electric scooter, and are found in Bucharest, the diaspora, and to a certain extent Transylvania. It currently has 55 deputies, 25 senators, or roughly 18% of parliament, and sends 8 members to EU Parliament, who sit in the Renew Europe group. It is currently headed by Dacian Cholos, the former Prime Minister and a current member of EU Parliament, and former head of the Renew Europe group. USR prides itself as an anti-corruption party. It wants to remove those with a criminal record from holding public office, reduce the number of MPs, local officials, and bureaucrats in the country, and wants to move to a 2-round first-past-the-post system of voting for mayors. They are very pro-EU, supporting increased integration within the Union, and backs pro-EU liberals in Moldova. They want to encourage entrepreneurship and believe in greater choice for patients in healthcare and parents in education. They also are apparently sympathetic towards greater LGBTQ rights, although they seem to be fairly quiet on this. Part of the reason they are likely fairly quiet on this is because Romania is a fairly conservative country socially, so USR has to keep a lower profile on positions like this for fear of alienating voters. USR also is just considered a party for a very certain type of Romanians. It does very well among young people in the cities, but once you get out into the countryside or in areas where people are struggling more, you see USR doing quite poorly and failing to actually connect with voters in these regions. Part of this is blamed on just the fact that the party is fairly young and hasn't made a name for itself yet. Next we go to the Alianta Pentru Unire Romanilor, or Alliance for the Union of Romanians, or AUR. AUR is the furthest right party in parliament, representing nationalist, right-wing populist, and hard-right orthodox. It supports a very nationalistic view of the country, wanting to return Romania to its previous glory, a very nationalistic trope, I know. It seeks to unite the nation of Romania via right-wing policies, and notably has called for Romania to expand its borders into areas with large Romanian populations that the country used to control, particularly the country of Moldova. It also, fun fact, operates in Moldova, making it one of the few parties that contest elections in 2 countries, although the Moldovan branch seems fairly weak and ineffective. Its support base is often among rural Orthodox, who feel abandoned by traditional politics, usually tend to be younger, are less likely to have a university education, and gets a lot of support in the regions of Moldavia, Dobruja, and the diaspora. It currently has 30 deputies and 13 senators, or roughly 10% of parliament. While not in the EU Parliament, it is affiliated with the European Conservative and Reformist group. It is currently headed by George Simon, a deputy, and Claudiu Tarziu, a senator. AUR, as stated previously, believes in uniting the wider Romanian nation, wanting to form a version of Greater Romania. It is not opposed to the EU, but opposes further integration, wanting Romania to play a bigger role in the politics of Eastern Europe, with the aid of NATO, but not subservient to it. It is strongly sympathetic to the Romanian Orthodox Church, opposing a secular state, abortion, and greater LGBTQ rights. Wants to fight corruption in the country, tends to be sympathetic towards the anti-vax movement, and strongly opposes increased deforestation. It also is fairly hostile towards minority organizations in the country, wanting to ban UDMR, accusing it of being solely loyal to Hungary and not Romania. This hostile attitude towards minorities has led the party to be accused of racism, particularly against Hungarians, but also against just non-Romanians in general. The party has rejected that it is hateful, but you can also find reports that members of the party are sympathetic towards the fascist interwar legionary movement. There is an accusation that the party is a vanity project for Simon, and that he essentially let anyone into his movement in order for it to expand, which is why you can find not just fascist, but apparently criminals, gang members, and just miscreants in the party. I also saw a YouTube comment saying that the party is a psyop and controlled by the Freemasons, so maybe there is some skepticism on the right that the party is genuine about its beliefs. However, despite all this, the party is actually rising in the polls, with its alternative way of doing politics appealing to still a minority of the population, but a growing one. So the last group present in parliament is not actually a single party, but more a collection of small minority parties. There are 18 of these parties, representing the 18 seats reserved for minorities, each representing a different minority group. Some of the largest parties are the Party of the Roma, League of Albanians in Romania, and the Democratic Forum of Germans in Romania, with these parties getting 14.5, 9, and 7,500 votes in the last election respectively. Some of the smallest are the Federation of Jewish Communities in Romania, Union of Croatians in Romania, and the Democratic Union of Turkish Muslim Tartars, with 3.5, 3.25, and 2,800 votes respectively. All these parties, while with different electorates and interests in mind, generally tend to all fight for the same thing. They oppose racism in Romania, They want to promote their respective minority groups' language and culture, favor a certain amount of autonomy for them, and are a vehicle to get members of their community into office. They also serve as a place for members of their community to get into contact with each other and put on cultural events and parades. Overall, these groups aren't vital to understanding Romanian politics, but they are an interesting force in the country. So those are all the parties in Parliament, but there's two more that send members to EU Parliament and are present in local politics. First is the Partitul Mișcarea Populară, or the People's Movement Party, or PMP. PMP is a conservative party that was formed from supporters of former President Traian Băsescu, who seemingly are mainly found in rural areas. It's overall been a pretty small party, getting around 5% of the vote in the elections that it has contested. However, in the latest election in 2020, it fell just slightly below the electoral threshold, getting 4.82% of the vote, just 0.18% short, and thus being removed from Parliament. It does, however, still have two members in EU Parliament, who sit in the European People's Party group. It is currently headed by Cristian Diaconescu, a former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Senator. It advocates for socially conservative policy, like opposing gay marriage, supporting patriotism and the Romanian language, opposes increased immigration, and wants to ban the destruction of any heritage monuments. It also wants to reduce social programs, saying that those who work should get more than those who don't, wants to do more to involve the diaspora in the affairs of Romania, favors free market and right-wing economics, is pro-EU, and wants to merge Moldova and Romania together. The last party we will talk about is the Pro-Romania Party, or just simply Pro. Pro is a center-left-ish party that was formed as a breakoff of the PSD in 2018. It was formed from supporters of former Prime Minister and current party leader of Pro, Victor Ponta. Ponta was Prime Minister from 2012 to 2015, and left office after a series of protests against his government's handling of a nightclub fire that killed 64, and just corruption in his government. It wants to invest more in infrastructure, wants more social workers, wants to crack down on violence against women, and is pro-EU. It failed to enter Parliament in 2020, but does still have one member who sits in EU Parliament, who sits in the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. So those are the parties in Romania. In conclusion, there are two main parties of the center-left, PSD, and center-right, PNL. A liberal anti-corruption party, USR, a hard-right nationalist party, AUR, a party for Hungarians, UDMR, along with smaller parties representing small minority groups, and backers of former leaders of the country. Anyways, hope you enjoyed. So thank you again to Victor for helping me out with this episode. I think he asked it like a couple months ago, and ever since he's been sending me like monthly updates with what's going on in Romania, and he updated me all through the government crisis that was going on. Big thank you to him. I always appreciate it when someone from the country I'm talking about reaches out and talks to me. It's nice to get their perspective, just so it's not just me reading like news articles and trying to find like a video or something that may or may not explain it well. But yeah, next episode is Spanish parties, and then I'll do the history of Brazil, which is probably going to take a while, but I'll see how fast I can get it out. And then I'll do Indian parties, although I'm only going to do a couple since there's like 50 in the Indian parliament, which is just like a crazy number. So I'm going to whittle it down to an easy like 17. But yeah, thank you for watching. My email is whydocountries@gmail.com for if you want to send your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.